The rain had nothing to do with what happened that morning. The sun was out, bright and normal, like the day had no idea what it was about to witness. The elevator doors opened on the 40th floor of Callaway Tower, and a man stepped out wearing a suit that looked like it had survived a war. The jacket was torn at the shoulder. The sleeve was frayed. There was a small tear near the knee of his pants, the kind you get from crawling under a car or falling on concrete. His shoes were scuffed. His tie was crooked. His name was Nathaniel Cole. Nobody in that building knew who he really was. The receptionist at the front desk looked up, then looked away, like she was embarrassed for him. A security guard almost stopped him, then decided a man dressed like that probably wasn't worth the trouble of a conversation. Nathaniel walked past both of them without saying a word. He walked like a man who had walked those halls 1,000 times before, even though nobody there had ever seen his face. He pushed open the door to the boardroom. 12 people sat around a long glass table. Coffee cups, tablets, expensive pens nobody used because everything was digital now. At the head of the table sat a man named Richard Callaway, silver-haired, sharp-suited, the acting CEO of Callaway Industries. Next to him sat his daughter, Beatrice, who ran marketing and treated the office like her personal runway. And near the window, arms crossed, trying not to laugh and failing, stood a woman named Margaret Hale. She wasn't laughing at him out of cruelty. She was young, exhausted, still new enough to the company to be nervous all the time. And when nervous people see something absurd, sometimes a laugh escapes before kindness can stop it. She caught herself half a second too late. "Can I help you?" Richard said, not standing up. "This is a private board meeting." "I'm aware," Nathaniel said. "Sir, I think you have the wrong floor," Beatrice said, smirking. "The laundry room is downstairs." The room laughed. All of it. 12 grown adults in expensive clothes, laughing at a man in a torn suit, like it was the funniest thing they'd seen all quarter. Someone made a joke about homeless shelters. Someone else asked if he needed directions to the subway. Nathaniel didn't laugh. He didn't get angry either. He just walked to the empty chair at the far end of the table, the one nobody used because it belonged, technically, to nobody, and he sat down. Richard's smile disappeared. Security. Now. 2 guards stepped in from a hallway. Nathaniel raised one hand, calm as still water. "Before you touch me," he said, "you should know something." "And what's that?" Richard said, already reaching for his phone. Nathaniel looked at every face in that room, one at a time, slow, like he wanted them to remember this moment for the rest of their lives. "I own this company," he said. "All of it. Every share, every floor, every desk you're sitting at." Silence dropped over the room like a heavy blanket. "That's impossible," Richard said, but his voice cracked on the word impossible. Nathaniel reached into his torn jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He slid it down the long glass table. It stopped right in front of Richard. Richard opened it. His face went white. And that's where we leave it for now. Before we go back into the story, if you're enjoying this, hit subscribe, share this with someone who loves a good redemption story, and drop a comment telling me where you think this story is headed. It helps more than you know. Okay, back to Nathaniel. 3 months earlier, Nathaniel Cole was living in a small apartment above a laundromat on the edge of the city. He didn't own a car. He rode the bus. He ate dinner alone most nights, usually something simple, like eggs and toast, because cooking for one person never felt worth the effort. Nobody who saw him on that bus would have guessed the truth, that his father, Walter Callaway, had built one of the largest companies in the country from nothing. That Nathaniel was the only son, that somewhere in a vault, in a lawyer's office, in a will nobody had read yet, his name was written next to the word everything. But Nathaniel didn't want to hand it to him. Not like that. His father had taught him one thing above everything else. Money changes how people treat you, and if you want to know who someone really is, you have to meet them before they know what you're worth. So Nathaniel disappeared. He gave up the penthouse. He gave up the driver. He took the torn suit, the same one his father wore the day he signed the papers to start the company 40 years ago, kept in a box like a memory, and he wore it on purpose. Torn, old, honest. He wanted to see what Callaway Industries had become while his father was dying quietly in a hospital bed 3 miles away, a secret Nathaniel carried alone, heavier than any of them could imagine. That's why he walked into the boardroom that day. Not for revenge, for truth. And in that room, one person hadn't laughed the loudest. One person had looked at him with something that wasn't mockery. It was curiosity and maybe a little bit of shame for laughing at all. Margaret Hale. She found him 20 minutes later, sitting alone on a bench outside the building, staring at nothing. "I'm sorry," she said, "for laughing. That wasn't right." Nathaniel looked up at her. "You're the only one who apologized. I'm probably going to get fired for talking to you right now." "You won't," he said. And something in the way he said it made her wonder if he knew something she didn't. She sat down next to him anyway. Not because it was smart, because something about his eyes made her feel like the whole world had gone quiet for a second, like the noise of the city had turned itself down just to let them talk. "You didn't deny it," she said. "In there, that you own the company." "No," he said. "I didn't." "Is it true?" Nathaniel looked at his hands. "Torn cuffs. Old fabric. It's complicated." "That's not an answer." "No," he said, almost smiling. "It's not." They sat there for a long time, two strangers on a bench, while 40 floors above them, panic spread through Callaway Industries like fire through dry grass. By the next morning, everyone in the building knew his name. Nathaniel Cole. Some said he was a lawyer testing them. Some said he was an investor doing a hostile takeover. Nobody knew the real truth, that he was Walter Callaway's only son, and that his father, the man who built the company from a single office and a single idea, was lying in a hospital bed with a heart that was slowly giving out. Richard Callaway was not Nathaniel's father. Richard was his father's business partner, a man Walter trusted with the company's daily operations while he searched for his son, the son who had walked away from money and title 15 years ago because he couldn't stand what it had done to his mother, who died believing love and money could never live in the same house. Richard had spent those 15 years slowly convincing the board that Nathaniel would never come back, slowly convincing them that when Walter passed, the company should go to a trust controlled by Richard himself. He had lawyers ready. He had documents drafted. All he needed was time. And now the son had walked back through the door, wearing a torn suit, holding a single piece of paper that could undo everything Richard had built in the shadows. That night, Richard sat in his office long after everyone had gone home, staring at that same document, the one Nathaniel had placed on the table. It wasn't a stock certificate. It wasn't a legal filing. It was something simpler and far more dangerous. A letter, handwritten, from Walter Callaway himself, naming Nathaniel as sole heir and giving him full voting power over the entire company, effective the moment he chose to claim it. Richard picked up his phone and made a call. "We have a problem," he said. "The son is back." Margaret didn't know any of this yet. All she knew was that a man in a torn suit had looked at her like she was the first honest thing he'd seen in months, and that something about him made her chest feel tight in a way she hadn't felt in years, not since her husband passed and left her raising their daughter alone, working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. She wasn't looking for romance. She wasn't looking for anything except a paycheck and a little bit of peace. But peace is a strange way of showing up wearing a torn suit and looking at you like you matter. The next few weeks moved slowly, the way good stories do. Nathaniel started coming to the office more, not as an owner throwing his weight around, but quietly, almost invisibly, watching, learning, listening. He asked Margaret questions about her department. He remembered small details, her daughter's name, the fact that she took the early bus so she could pick her daughter up from school by 4. Nobody else remembered things like that about her. Not even the people she'd worked with for 3 years. Slowly, without either of them naming it, something began to grow. Not loud, not dramatic. The kind of love that grows in quiet moments, a shared coffee in the break room, a walk to the bus stop, a conversation that started about spreadsheets and somehow ended 2 hours later talking about dreams neither of them had said out loud to anyone in years. But every quiet love story needs a storm to test it. And theirs was coming. Richard moved first. He called an emergency board meeting and presented forged documents claiming the handwritten letter was fake, that Walter Callaway had been mentally unfit when he wrote it, weakened by his illness, unable to make sound decisions. He painted Nathaniel as an opportunist, a stranger who showed up the moment his father got sick, chasing money he never earned. It worked on some of the board. Doubt is a powerful thing, and Richard was good at planning it. Nathaniel was summoned to a hearing. Not a courtroom, yet a private arbitration, lawyers on both sides, the kind of room where fortunes are decided quietly, without a jury, without cameras, without mercy. Margaret sat in the back row. She wasn't supposed to be there. She came anyway. "The letter is authentic," Nathaniel's lawyer said, sliding forward a stack of documents. "Verified by 3 independent handwriting experts. Mr. Calloway was a sound mind. We have medical records to prove it." Richard's lawyer stood. "Medical records provided by the same hospital where Mr. Calloway is currently a patient. Convenient, isn't it? You're suggesting we fabricated medical records?" Nathaniel said, standing now, his voice low and steady. "My father is dying. He is in that hospital right now, fighting for every breath. And you're standing here trying to steal what he built before his heart even stops beating." The room went silent. "You don't get to talk about honor," Nathaniel continued. "Not after 15 years of convincing him his own son abandoned him. When the truth is you buried every letter I sent. Every one." Richard's face changed, just slightly, just enough for Margaret to see it from the back row. The flicker of a man who knew he'd been caught. "That's a serious accusation," the arbitrator said. "I have proof," Nathaniel said quietly. "It's being delivered to this room right now." And right on cue, the door opened. A hospital administrator walked in, carrying a small box. Inside were dozens of letters, unopened, addressed to Walter Calloway, sender, Nathaniel Cole, spanning almost a decade. Letters Richard had intercepted and hidden. Letters that proved Nathaniel never abandoned his father at all. Richard stood up, so fast his chair fell backward. "Sit down, Mr. Calloway," the arbitrator said. Richard didn't sit down. He walked straight for the door instead, and 2 security guards stepped in front of him before he could leave the building. That night, Nathaniel didn't celebrate. He went straight to the hospital. His father was awake, barely, tubes running from his arms, the machines around him beeping in a slow, steady rhythm that felt too fragile to trust. "You found the letters," Walter whispered. "I found everything," Nathaniel said, sitting beside the bed, taking his father's hand. "I'm sorry it took so long." "You came back," Walter said. "That's all that ever mattered." Nathaniel felt something break open in his chest, something he'd been holding closed for 15 years. He cried, quietly, the way strong men cry when nobody taught them how. And his father, weak as he was, squeezed his hand like he still had the strength to hold his son up. "There's a girl," Walter said, his voice barely a whisper. "I saw her in the security footage, the one who apologized." Nathaniel almost laughed through his tears. "You've been watching security footage from your hospital bed." "I built that company to give someone a good life," Walter said. "Not just money, a life. Don't waste it being alone, son. I wasted enough years doing that after your mother passed." Before Nathaniel could answer, the monitor beside the bed let out a long, flat, terrible sound. Nurses rushed in. A doctor pushed past him, shouting numbers Nathaniel didn't understand. Someone pulled him back from the bed as they worked, machines beeping, voices overlapping, his father's hand slipping out of his. And that's exactly where we have to stop. If this story has your heart racing right now, comment the word "stay" below if you need to know what happens to Walter and whether Nathaniel makes it back in time to say the things he never got to say. Subscribe so you don't miss the next part, because trust me, this story is only getting started, and what happens next between Nathaniel and Margaret is going to break you in the best way possible. I stopped there purely as a retention beat. That's the cliffhanger point in the formula. Here's the next chunk, picking up right where we left off. The doctor's hands moved fast. Nathaniel stood frozen against the wall, watching his father's chest, waiting for it to rise again, praying to a God he hadn't spoken to in years. "Charging," the doctor said. The machine beeped once, then again, then a third time, and this time the line on the screen jumped back into a rhythm. Slow, weak, but there. "He's back," the nurse said, heart rate stabilizing. Nathaniel's knees almost gave out. He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor of the hospital hallway, his torn suit crumpled around him, his hands shaking. A nurse crouched beside him and told him his father was stable for now, that the next 48 hours would tell them more, that he should go home and rest. He didn't go home. He called Margaret instead. She showed up 20 minutes later in a coat thrown over her pajamas, hair pulled back messy. No makeup, nothing performed about her at all. She didn't say a word. She just sat down on the floor next to him in that hallway and put her hand over his. "You don't have to talk," she said. "I'll just sit here." And for the first time in 15 years, Nathaniel didn't feel alone in a hospital hallway. He felt like maybe, just maybe, his father was right about one thing, that a life built only on money was never the life worth having. Walter held on, not just through that night, but through the week that followed, and slowly, the color came back into his face, and the doctor started using words like recovering instead of critical. With Walter stable, the company moved into a new kind of storm, the legal kind. Richard was formally removed from his position pending investigation, but he wasn't finished. Men like Richard never go quietly. He had spent 15 years building loyalty in the building, and loyalty, even bought loyalty, doesn't disappear overnight. Beatrice came to Nathaniel's office one afternoon, and for once, there was no smirk on her face. "I didn't know what my father was doing," she said. "I want you to believe that. Did you know he hid my letters?" "No," she said, and her voice cracked in a way that sounded real. "I found out with everyone else." In that room, Nathaniel studied her for a long moment. "I want to believe you, but you don't." "Not yet," he said. "Give me a reason to." She nodded, like she expected that answer, and turned to leave. At the door, she stopped. "There's something else," she said. "Something my father's been hiding that has nothing to do with the letters. It's about the merger. The one everyone thinks is worth $1 billion. Nathaniel's stomach tightened. "What about it?" "It's not what it looks like," Beatrice said. "And when you find out, you're going to need someone in that boardroom who's actually on your side." She left before he could ask another question, and Nathaniel sat there, alone, staring at the closed door, feeling the ground shift beneath him one more time. That night, he told Margaret everything. The merger, Beatrice's warning, the strange feeling that this fight was far from over. They sat on the small balcony outside her apartment, the city lights spread out below them, her daughter asleep inside. "Do you trust her?" Margaret asked. "I don't know," Nathaniel admitted. "I don't know who to trust anymore. Except you." Margaret turned to look at him, really look at him, the way she had that first day on the bench outside the office. "Why me?" "Because you're the only person in this whole story who never once asked me for anything," he said. "Not money, not a promotion, not a favor. You apologized for laughing at a stranger in a torn suit, and that's it. That's all you ever wanted from me." "Maybe I want something now," she said quietly. "What's that?" She didn't answer with words. She leaned in, slow, giving him every chance to pull away, and he didn't. The kiss was soft, careful, the kind shared by two people who had both been hurt before and knew exactly how fragile this new thing between them really was. When they pulled back, Nathaniel rested his forehead against hers. "I have to go back to that boardroom," he said, "and I don't know what Beatrice found." "Then go find out," Margaret said, "and come back to me after." He stood up to leave, and just as he reached the door, his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer it. He should have let it ring. "Nathaniel Cole?" A voice said on the other end, calm, professional, cold. "Who is this?" "My name is Diane Ashford. I'm an attorney representing a woman named Claire Calloway. She says she's your father's daughter, your half-sister, and she says the entire company legally belongs to her." The phone nearly slipped from his hand. Diane Ashford's voice stayed calm on the other end of the line, like she said sentences like that every day of her career. "Claire has documentation," she continued. "A birth certificate, DNA test results comparing her to a sample of Walter Calloway's hair from a hospital procedure 8 years ago. She's requesting a meeting. Tomorrow. Her lawyers believe she has a legitimate claim to half the estate." Nathaniel sat back down on the balcony step. Phone pressed his ear, the city lights blurring in front of him. Margaret sat beside him, watching his face change from confusion to something closer to fear. "Send everything to my legal team," he said finally, and hung up. "A sister," Margaret said softly. "You never mentioned a sister." "Because I never had one," Nathaniel said. "As far as I knew." He didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table with his father's old photographs spread out in front of him, looking for something, anything, that might explain how a woman named Claire Calloway could exist without him ever knowing. Photographs of his mother. Photographs of his father, younger, before the company was anything more than a rented office and a stack of unpaid bills. And one photograph, tucked in the back of an old book that he had never seen before. His father, standing next to a woman who wasn't his mother, holding a baby. The date on the back of the photograph was written in his father's handwriting. 29 years ago, 2 years before Nathaniel was born. By morning, he had his answer without needing Claire's lawyer to give it to him. His father had a life before his mother. A life he never spoke of. A daughter he may or may not have known about. He went to the hospital first, before anything else. Walter was sitting up now, stronger than he'd been in weeks, color back in his cheeks, the machines around him quieter than before. Nathaniel set the photograph on the blanket in front of him. Walter looked at it for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was small. Her name was Rosalind, he said. I was young, foolish. It ended before you were ever thought of, and I told myself it didn't matter because I never knew if there was a child. She left. I never heard from her again. I convinced myself I imagined the whole thing, because believing it was real meant living with the guilt of never looking for the truth. There's a woman, Nathaniel said quietly, claiming to be your daughter, claiming to be my sister. She wants half of everything. Walter closed his eyes. Then she's telling the truth. You don't know that. I know, Walter said, because I never once in 29 years had the courage to find out. If she's real, son, she deserves more than a fight in a boardroom. She deserves an apology I should have given her a long time ago. Nathaniel sat with that for a long moment. Anger and sympathy tangled together in his chest in a way he didn't know how to separate. What do I do? He asked. And for the first time since he'd walked back into that boardroom in his torn suit, he sounded like a lost son asking his father for help, instead of a man who owned an empire. You do what I never did, Walter said. You look her in the eye before you look at a single document. You find out who she is as a person before you let the lawyers turn her into a line item. Claire Calloway walked into Nathaniel's office 3 days later. She wasn't what he expected. No expensive suit. No entourage of lawyers standing behind her like a wall. Just a woman in her early 30s, tired-looking, holding a folder against her chest like it was the only thing keeping her steady. I didn't come here for the money, she said before he could speak. I came here because my mother died last year, still wondering if the man in this photograph ever thought about us. I need to know if he did. Nathaniel studied her face and saw, for the first time, the resemblance. The same eyes his father had. The same stubborn set of the jaw Nathaniel saw in the mirror every morning. He didn't know you existed, Nathaniel said. Not for certain, but he never stopped wondering, either. He told me that an hour ago. Claire's eyes filled with tears she clearly hadn't planned on showing him. I don't want a war, she said. I just wanted to be seen. That's all I ever wanted. Then let's start there, Nathaniel said. Not as a lawsuit. As family. Whatever that ends up meaning. It was the first time in the entire story that a conflict resolved itself not through a twist, or a courtroom, or a piece of paper sliding across a glass table, but through two strangers choosing honesty over war. And it changed the temperature of everything that came after. But Richard Calloway was still out there, and men who lose everything rarely lose quietly. Beatrice's warning about the merger turned out to be the most dangerous threat of all. The billion-dollar deal Calloway Industries had been finalizing for over a year wasn't just a business transaction. It was Richard's exit plan. Buried in the fine print, hidden behind layers of shell companies, was a clause that would transfer controlling interest of the merged company to an account Richard controlled personally the moment the deal closed. If Nathaniel hadn't stopped it in time, the entire company his father built from nothing would have quietly become Richard's, wrapped in legal language so complicated most of the board would never have noticed until it was far too late. Nathaniel called an emergency session. This time, Beatrice stood beside him instead of her father. Claire sat in the room, too, not as an enemy, but as a Calloway, finally given a seat at a table that should have been hers years ago. Richard arrived expecting to defend himself. He didn't expect to see his own daughter standing against him. You'd really do this? He said to Beatrice, his voice shaking with something that looked almost like heartbreak. "You had a son's letters from a dying man," Beatrice said, her voice steady even though her hands weren't. "You tried to steal a company built by someone else's sacrifice. I spent my whole life trying to make you proud, and it took a stranger in a torn suit to show me what that pride actually cost." The board voted unanimously. Richard was removed completely, stripped of every share, every title, every claim to a company he had spent 15 years trying to steal one quiet decision at a time. Security walked him out of the building the same way they'd almost walked Nathaniel out, months earlier in that very same suit. Nobody laughed this time. Walter Calloway left the hospital 3 weeks later, thinner, slower, leaning on a cane he refused to admit he needed. He stood at the top of the steps outside Calloway Tower with his son on one side, and for the first time, his daughter on the other, and he looked up at the building with tears in his eyes. "I built this so nobody would ever look at our family the way people looked at us when I had nothing," he said. "I forgot, somewhere along the way, that the reason was always supposed to be love. Not the building. Never the building." That evening, Nathaniel took Margaret to dinner, not in some expensive restaurant with a view of the skyline, but at the same small diner near her apartment where they'd first really talked, the one with cracked vinyl booze and coffee that was always a little too strong. "You could take me anywhere in the world," Margaret said, laughing, "and you bring me here. This is where I remembered what mattered," he said. "I wanted to come back to it with you." He reached into his jacket, the same torn jacket, the one he'd never had repaired, the one that started everything, and pulled out a small velvet box. Margaret's laughter stopped. "I know it's fast," he said. "I know the last few months have been the strangest, most impossible few months either of us have ever lived through. But you sat on a hospital floor with me, in your pajamas, when you didn't have to. You never once asked me what I owned. You only ever asked who I was. I want to spend the rest of my life being that person, with you for real, no torn suits, no secrets, nothing hidden." Margaret was crying before he even opened the box. "Yes," she said, before he'd even asked the question out loud. "Yes." A year later, the boardroom at Calloway Tower looked different. New paint, new faces. Claire sitting at the head of the table now, running the philanthropic branch of the company her father had spent his whole life avoiding building. Beatrice, humbled and steady, leading marketing with none of the sharp edges she used to hide behind. Margaret no longer an employee, but not entirely a stranger to that building either. Walking in some mornings with a little girl on her hip, who called Nathaniel something he never thought he'd hear a child call him again after losing his own mother so young, Dad. Walter didn't make it to the wedding. He passed peacefully in his sleep 2 months before, holding his son's hand one final time, having finally said everything he needed to say. But he made it long enough to see his family whole again, long enough to see the company he built become something bigger than money, something built on people who finally chose honesty over pride. At the wedding, held in the same building where a room full of strangers once laughed at a man in a torn suit, Nathaniel stood at the altar wearing that very same suit, stitched and mended by Margaret's own hands a night before. Torn seams turned into something beautiful instead of something hidden. "Why this one?" the officiant asked quietly, noticing the fabric. "Because the people who laughed at this suit," Nathaniel said, looking out at Margaret walking toward him, "never knew it was about to become the most important day of my life." And as the two of them stood there, hand in hand, in a room that once held nothing but mockery and now held nothing but love, the story that began with humiliation ended exactly the way the best stories always do, proving that the people who judge you at your lowest rarely deserve a seat at your table when you finally rise.